Welcome to Designing Learning That Matters. We are going to start with grounding.
Thank you. So we are going to begin with a land acknowledgement. Elizabeth and I are both in New York City, specifically Staten Island. And so this is reflective of New York City, but also I will also ask if you, after I read the statement, if you would like to publicly acknowledge the indigenous peoples of the land you're currently on, you can feel free to do so after. So we acknowledge that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Lenape people, who have stewarded this land for generations. We recognize their ongoing connection to this land, water, and community. We honor the Lenape, their ancestors, and the indigenous peoples of the region, past and present, who continue to make important contributions to the community and the world. We acknowledge the history of displacement, colonization, and erasure that has impacted indigenous peoples and are committed to working towards justice and equity for all. And so I'll just ask if you do have, just like, for example, Sharon shared, Navajo peoples are where she is. If there are people who you would like to acknowledge, please do so. I mean, yeah, tribes, cultures that you would like to acknowledge, please do so in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ife. And with all of the honoring that we do, action is the most important. And so resources for learning, and again, because we are in New York State, we are highlighting legal land back opportunities and wins that members of our community can get involved in. And we'll be sharing all of this. We know that this is not a general workshop about learning today. We are here because we are all in the work and in the life of opening minds, making changes, countering injustice. We can move to the next slide. It can be especially hard to be present and especially valuable to be present together when our ground right now is built on the labor and the land that has been exploited over generations. And right now, there is also so much hope, so much opportunity for truth and for repair. So we just want to acknowledge we're bringing in all different states of being. We are in times of unsettling, reckoning, and turning points. Our bodies and the land hold the weight of trauma and survival. For some of us, this feels new. For some of us, this is anything but new. For the sum of us in our intentional time today, we are creating our interdependent future. And as we move on to the next slide, please do whatever you need to do to move, to breathe, to eat, to nurture. And we can go to the next slide. So this is me, Dr. Elizabeth Speck. I am here in a photo with some of my favorite leopard print with the background of New York City on a cloudy day. And you can read the different accomplishments and credentials. But what's most important, if we can do another click, is that I am motivated to do the work that I do from a personal place of being a lifelong learner and having learned and unlearned many things and brought forward a lot of wisdom from my ancestral history, and also being in intention around the learning that still needs to be done. And so MindOpen is the culmination of my 25, 30 years working in New York City Human Services as a therapist, a case manager, a supervisor, a trainer, a consultant, a manager, all the hats different systems, often siloed, but all often serving the same need for justice. And so connection, compassion, courage, and critical thinking are the values that fuel how I show up and what I want to get involved in. And that leads us to what we're doing today. So today we hope that you will gain practical tools and reinforce some of your instincts and your knowledge. We are shaping today's session around centering the learner, designing with goals in mind, equity and engagement, and taking action steps. And then because we have such fabulous people who've chosen to join us today, we save time for Q&A and also for people to meet and connect with one another. We've got folks who are from youth education, from adult education, and everywhere in between today. So as with everything, we want to build on knowledge, introduce theories and research from a practical standpoint. So today you will gain instructional design models, theories of learning, and differentiated learning strategies. We could take it to the next slide. This is why I am so proud and honored that Dr. Ife Akinsheye Damon has chosen to join us today so we can mix it up and weave together a lot of really important work. Over to you, Dr. Ife.
Thank you, Elizabeth, Dr. Elizabeth. So my name is Ife, and I am honored to be here. It is a pleasure to meet you all, or to, I look forward to engaging with you all throughout this session today. So I'm not going to read through everything, but I will just share that I am a master educator. I've been in education for decades and have taught or led at all of the levels. I'm a major advocate for community-based education. That is, I say, the hill that I want to die on. I would love to see community-based education continue to expand across the globe. And I'm also a recognized leader in education. And so I've had the honor to be highlighted in multiple publications, including Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and some other local publications as well. And I'll just share, you can definitely look at this in more detail on your own. But I want to just also say thank you to MindOpen for allowing the community-based education movement, if we can go back, to the Global Academy for Community-Based Education, which is the nonprofit arm of the community-based education movement, for allowing GACB is the acronym to be a recipient of proceeds as a result of today's session. And so just to provide a little bit of information about community-based education movement, which, thank you, Sharon, has just put the link in the chat. The focus of the community-based education movement is to bring awareness to community-based education, to provide knowledge and support to teachers, to students, and to community partners on how to collaborate together in order to help students engage in community-based education projects. And then the final piece is just always conducting ongoing research. And so you may be saying to yourself, well, what is community-based education? So community-based education is any type of instructional model that allows what's happening in a community to be connected to what students are learning in the classroom. My focus specifically is on bringing the community and the classroom together, because I do believe that the community is a resource that's needed in schools. We know the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, but I also believe that it takes a child to raise a village, in that young people are an untapped resource that's needed in the community. We often say children are the future, but I believe children are the now, and we need to utilize them now in order to make our world a better place. And so I won't go into too much detail around community-based education, all the things that we do, but just, know that the focus is bringing the community and the classroom together, whether that's in the school building or outside the school building. And the goal is to help students use their academic skills and their 21st century skills to learn about and improve their community. So to all who have donated to the community-based education movement's nonprofit GACB, I just want to say thank you now for your donation and your support. And you can feel free to check out the websites to learn more about what we're doing. And I'm always inviting people to join the movement. So you, the link that was shared in the chat, you can use that link to join the movement. Thank you.
Thank you. So we started with the why is this important to us and what are we bringing from our souls today? And we'd like to invite you to take a moment and share in the chat. Why are you choosing to spend time on this workshop about learning today? And why do you do the work that you do? And we'll just allow for a few seconds of silence to ground in the why. And while we stay here for a moment, knowing that the folks who are here today and who will be listening to this later are on the front lines of some of the most challenging work today. It can be easy to lose track of the details of planning or of design when we're dealing with crises and emergencies and conflict and opportunities. So, do any of the following sound familiar? Oh, actually, we do have time. And so, thank you for that, for the chat, Ife. Do we have anyone who would like to unmute and say a little bit more about why you're here and your why for your work? Appreciate these comments from Elliot. I'm on a lifelong path of learning, picking up tools and techniques along the journey. Karen, deepening skills in delivering educational content. Dario, impacted by criminal legal system and caring about the success of men and women impacted by the system. Yeah. Would anyone like to unmute? Darby is, yeah.
He said he want, Darby shared that they want to get deeper into how to make learning experiences more meaningful for adult learners, collecting
Yeah.
the learning to the practical in ways that also foster emotional and community connections. Yes, and giving some snaps to that.
All of that.
Yes.
All of that. So let's go to the next slide.
Okay. Victoria, though, before we
Oh,
do, if we can, let Victoria unmute to share
yes.
properly.
Sure. I guess I'm thinking about the through line for all my work. I've always worked in the nonprofit sector, worked on the program side, I've worked on the philanthropy side. Now I work for myself as a contractor. And I think the core values that have always led me really apply both to myself and to everyone I work with. So those are finding clarity around everything and anything that I do, building confidence around what it is that I'm doing or the projects I'm working on, and then using those two things to then make actionable changes. And then rinse and repeat over and over and over again. But it feels like those are the things, clarity, confidence, and change, which are, what I'm realizing are more of my core values, but they're also kind of how I show up in the work and how I engage and work with others.
Thank you for sharing that, Victoria. That's excellent. Very good.
Clarity, confidence, and change.
I like
And
those
from
two.
Dana, bringing in the trauma perspective, educating people and systems. Yeah. So that really brings us to the how do people learn? So just really quickly, If any of this sounds familiar, give us an emoji sign. So how do we create learning experiences that matter when my learners' needs are so different? It seems impossible to meet everyone's needs at once.
Or when my supervisor assigned me to lead an exercise in the staff meeting, but it's unclear what they're expecting.
We need new staff to learn the way we work more quickly, but there's nothing in writing and we have no time.
Or also, one training isn't going to solve the real problems in this organization.
And other challenges that you've had with fulfilling that why, please add them to the chat. We just want to keep holding the multiple things at once. And these are some of the challenges that we have heard often in our settings. So we can go to the next slide. Centering the learner. A couple of grounding quotes from Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks, liberatory educators. Whoever teaches learns in the act of teaching, and whoever learns teaches in the act of learning. And the classroom or the workplace, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. Next slide.
So you may hear language that is, you may hear us say classroom, you may hear us say student, you may hear us say learner, but what we want you to know that these principles are there for all learners. So, we often, well, for me, my background is in traditional classroom education. And so pedagogy is the focus, it's what we learn about in college and things like that. And it's just about the learning that's focused on the child being the learner, or the instructional process of the child being the learner. But also we have the andragogy, which is the process of the adult being the learner. And we hear a lot more about the pedagogy than we do the andragogy, but they're both really the same. They're the same principles, at least for today. There are some things, of course, psychological development that's different over time, but these best practices that we're sharing today are applicable to both children and adult learners. And it's really, when we think about learning, we want to think about that it's really the same for both. A lot of the basic criteria, and it's just, some things are changed depending on the audience, regardless of the age. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're seeing some great comments come in also around the challenges, capturing the expectations of the subject matter experts that might be contributing to the learning, and having complex concepts and not prioritizing new learning. Yeah. So I know there are a lot of people in this room who are focused on healing-centered engagement and using trauma-informed practices. And the thing about our brains is that when we are in survival mode, whether we are conditioned because of adverse childhood experiences and living with present stress to be on alert, or if we are under current traumatic stress, in order to protect ourselves, the brain is not concerned with learning new things. It is concerned with surviving. And so when we're in circumstances that are asking people to learn, especially complex concepts, it is not human-centered to do that in a way that is transactional or can even be felt as being forced. So the principles of trauma-informed care are useful everywhere, at home and in a learning environment. So that means if there's not physical and emotional safety, then there's not an ideal learning environment. And so that goes to trust And that goes to really acknowledging that sometimes the workplace or school is not a safe environment. And so those foundational root things need to be part of setting up a learning experience. Trustworthiness and transparency in the relation between the person who is facilitating or educating. Representation and cultural responsiveness. Even if inside the learning experience, there's lots of cultural humility and cultural specificity, if the environment in which that is happening is one that does not imbue belonging, then the environment is not ideal. Collaboration and mutual support. Learners at whatever age are not empty vessels to have a transactional experience and throw out facts. So how are we creating together, and how are we setting up among learners opportunities to connect? And finally, but also first, voice and choice. So are there opportunities to choose how to engage in the learning, and where are the ways that can be done? Is it through the content? Is it through the physical situation? So we can move on to the next slide, but we keep weaving this in. So the principles of adult learning, or I like to say engaged learning at any age, are that we human beings need to be involved in planning our own learning. We need to bring our own lived experience into the learning and have that reflection that we may or may not speak out loud, but we're making those connections. We need to believe that the learning has immediate value for their life or work, for our life or work. So the what's in it for me. And that's not being selfish. It's a human state that helps us focus on gaining knowledge and gaining learning when there's an infinite amount of stuff coming at us all the time. We need to participate in solving problems and challenges. And so that can be gamifying things within the learning experience, or it can also be acknowledging that the implementation for the learning that we're doing has challenges. And as we said from the very beginning, we need to feel safe enough in the learning space. And part of building trust is to acknowledge that safety is not something a facilitator or educator may have in their power to create for others. In today's environment and in the institutions that we're working in, that may not be the case, but acknowledging and making room for the truth of experience is part of the safe enough space where the survival brain can relax and the learning brain can come online. So what are some of your experiences and perspectives? What does it look like when engaged learning is happening? So internal motivation to learn, engaging in learning by choice. What do you see? What do you hear? What does it feel like? We'll invite you to share reflections in the chat if you'd like, and to come off of mute and share some of your thoughts. Looks like shared knowledge and growth and resistance. And if you think about experiences where you have had that vibe or had that observation. Yeah. As Victoria's writing, it can seem quiet and intimidating at first. Asking questions, body language is engaged and calm. Thank you, Courtney. Elliot, a light bulb or aha moment. Interest and self-motivation. Yeah. You might have a story or a moment that's coming to you. We have time for 1 or 2 shares.
I don't mind sharing. Excuse me. Um, Years ago, I was an elementary school teacher, and I remember teaching a lesson on, it was a science lesson right before lunch on shadows and how sun shines on the moon and the moon casts a shadow on Earth. And I used an overhead projector and ball and just was trying to move objects to demonstrate how the shadow shines or casts a blockage of light on the overhead projector. And so, I taught the lesson and we had to transition to lunch. And it was a bright sunny day in Florida, and the kids were single file lined up on the way to the lunch. And all I kept hearing is, "Mr. Adams, look, a shadow on the ground." As they were walking, they recognized that their own person was casting a shadow on the ground as they walked. So that was just a moment in time for me some years ago. But yeah.
That's beautiful, Elliot. Thank you for bringing us into that picture. Mhm.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So as you sit with this and breathe with internal motivation, we see dialogue in the chat, curiosity, questions. We can move to the next slide. So if our goal is to build that internal motivation and making those connections, how do we design with those goals in mind? Often we are given a task to create a curriculum or facilitate a training, and there is an organizational goal or an institutional goal. But if we are not designing for that internal motivation, there can often be a mismatch. So when I was starting to be a trainer in nonprofit organizations, I didn't know there was a field of instructional design, and there actually is. And so in many corporations, if we can pull down all of the points, there are departments that have the resources to do these steps of instructional design. And a very common model is called ADDIE, which stands for analysis, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. And it's kind of a linear process. So analysis starts with what is the need? What are the skills gaps? What are the key performance indicators? And from there, the design, what are the intended outcomes? And how do you get from point A to point B? The team invests in that phase and then goes to development, where it's responsive to what is the design that's been agreed to by all of the invested parties. And then it's implementation, evaluating, and continuing to learn. The drawback of this kind of traditional approach is that it's linear. And so by the time you've invested so much and you get to implementation, if there are things that need to be tweaked or are not working, or if the environment has changed, it can be really laborious to go back. So another approach to instructional design is more iterative. It's the acronym Agile, which comes from software development and is applied to project management. And I know there may be some people who are here today who are much more deeply rooted in these fields than I am personally. But I've learned a lot from understanding that a model like Agile, where you start with the A for alignment and having the invested parties be on the same page about the intended outcomes, invest time in preparation, in determining roles, clarifying roles, not duplicating efforts, and then put the bulk of the creative energy into iterating, developing, and implementing. So designing pieces, trying them out, shifting them, changing them, applying lessons learned to the next piece. And leveraging. So continually learning, documenting learnings from what's working, what's not working, and building in evaluation at every phase of the learning experience, and checking for understanding, checking for alignment. So we're going to share a handout that can help you apply these models to projects that you may need to work on. And we can go to the next slide. We will also be providing you with a handout on the levels of learning evaluation, which I'll talk about very briefly. And then some AI, artificial intelligence, generative prompts that can be helpful in learning design that we've used at MindOpen. And a shout out to Sharon, our tech host, who also has a podcast on AI for change makers and helpers. So we can go to the next slide. In learning evaluation, often the measure of success is, do people like it? And if we're really talking about learning and the learning zone that involves stretching and a little discomfort, but not so much discomfort that we tune out, we need to be satisfied and engaged with the learning experience, but that isn't a measure of, are we learning? So the Kirkpatrick model is a common model in adult learning to get to results. First level is reaction satisfaction. Did you like it? Sometimes it's called a smile sheet. Knowledge confidence is knowledge gain. So that might be pre-post tests, or it might be self-report of level of confidence. This is often where evaluation should stop for the learning experiences that we might be designing in the workplace, because we're set up to feel unsuccessful if the expectation is there's going to be like behavioral or organizational change simply from a time-limited learning experience. But with investment, we can track what impact the learning experience might have on behavior and skills retention over time. And it might be that there's training being provided in addition to other interventions that are intended to bring about some change. And it takes analysis and thought to pinpoint what is it that you're evaluating. So we can go to step 4. That takes us to organizational results. When it's an organizational based learning experience, what is the purpose? What is the larger why? How does it track to the mission of the organization. And then finally, and this takes much more investment, what is the return on investment? What finances, what resources have been expended? And what is the value that's coming from that? Many of these are looked at in corporate environments and not so often in our nonprofit environments. And so part of the purpose is for facilitators, trainers, anybody who is using learning in your job to advocate for being measured on the things that what you're doing can accomplish, not the things that you can't accomplish. So moving on.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about equity and engagement. And we can go to the next slide. And so I just kind of want to place equity in context. It juxtaposed equality. So oftentimes we can hear about equality in learning, and now we're starting to hear about equity in education as well. And so when we think about equality, that means that everyone gets the same equal treatment. And it can sound nice in theory, you know, it's like, okay, it's equality, everybody's getting the same thing. But when we think about systems that have been in place or just the individual needs of learners, equality is not typically the best policy. And so instead, we should look at equity and using an equity model. And so if we can just go back to the other slide just quickly, these images reflect the difference between when we have equality versus equity. And so in the first slide, you see that equality means everybody has a traditional curb, okay? And, you know, but we can see that that's a barrier for someone who can't walk down the curb. Whereas with equity, if we have a ramp installed instead, then yes, people who can walk can also use, who have the, you know, ability to use their legs, they can use the ramp, but it's even more valuable for those, as we can see in the image, someone who has a wheelchair or someone who may have be visually impaired and have to use a cane, or other individuals. And so when we think of equity, not only can it be of value to the person who has that special need, but it also can even be useful for others. We can go to the other slide. And so this is just another visual representation of equality versus equity, but then you'll also see the third component, which is justice. And so we want to think about justice as the ultimate goal, the vision, where there are no barriers, you know, to whatever we want individuals to be able to access. And that is just, and that truly is what justice is, because a lot of times it's things that are actually barriers that have been put in place that require equity. And so if we can remove those barriers, those systemic challenges, then we can ultimately get to the vision of justice for all. Thank you. And so we are going to focus on the equity, though, in the meantime, for today's session. And I want to first just talk about the different types of learners that we can have, or the ways in which learners show up is a better way to say it. It's because we all have a variety of learning styles, and we all have a variety of multiple intelligences. So I'm just going to talk about those briefly. So when it comes to learning styles, this is the idea of how people learn. And so the typical three are the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic learning modalities. And so when it's visual, these are people who learn best when they're able to see the information. So for me, visually, I'd like to be able to see the information, whether it's images, but also even if it's just words and writing. But for me, I know that visual works best. Now, also we have auditory, which is for people who learn best by hearing the information. And for me, I know that auditory does not work for me. I cannot just listen to someone and then just retain the information. I definitely need to have a visual or be engaged in it, which leads to the third one, which is the kinesthetic. And though these are for people who are hands-on, they like to engage their body in the learning. I also can definitely gather information in this way. This works definitely very well for young people. For when we think about like elementary level students, when they get their bodies involved, they're more likely to kind of engage their full cellular, their full body. And so even that cellular memory can be reactivated in the future based on things that they learn as they're doing kinesthetic activities. And so these are the most common 3 types of learning styles. There are some others that have come along the way in time, but these are the top 3. And so these are what I'm focusing on for today. But then we also, in addition to learning styles, have multiple intelligences. And so this is a theory that Dr. Howard Gardner came up with back in the 80s, I believe. I can't remember exactly right in this moment, but there are 9 different multiple intelligence types. And so I'm going to just briefly talk about each of those as well, and start with the naturalist learner. So you'll see that image in that pretty tealish kind of color. The naturalist intelligence type is for people who are naturally inclined. So with the intelligence type, is more like an inclination of just their being, of how they engage with things, or what they find more engaging, what they're more drawn to. So for the naturalist intelligence type, people who are dominant in this area, they are more inclined to be connected to nature. So they like things in nature. It may also be animals, things that are just nature. It's just the easiest way to, and they're all pretty self-explanatory just by the titles. Musical is for people who are into music, whether it's the sounds, it's creating music, dancing, engaging with music. That's a way that's almost like their love language. And then we have logical mathematical, which is one of my strengths. And these are for people who like things to be rational, logical, to be kind of concrete. And also, I just will say this is one of the intelligence types that has the most success in school, because schools focus on logical, mathematical, and also verbal linguistic, which we'll talk about in just a second. And so yeah, people who do well in math are typically have a high mathematical intelligence type. Then we also have the existential, which is more of like metaphysical, spiritual side of things. And so you may think about people who are very just in tune with kind of all that is, like with people, but also with nature, with things. People who are, just kind of maybe have focus and like to spend their time thinking about the metaphysical aspect of life and what is beyond what we see. Then we also have the interpersonal. So these are people who are people persons. So this is another one that's a strength of mine. They are intelligent. And the reason why I know, not just from knowing myself, but also having taken intelligence assessments, these are the results. But I also just absolutely agree, just based on knowing myself. And so the interpersonal is the people person, the person who likes to engage with others. They learn from other people. That's one of the intelligence types. And then we also have the bodily kinesthetic. So very similar to the kinesthetic life learning style. It's someone who uses their bodies a lot. So this can be a dancer, it may be an athlete, someone who is a performer on stages like Broadway plays and things like that. So these are people who like to use their body to express. Then we also have the linguistic intelligence type, which I mentioned in opposition to the mathematical. This is the other one that schools focus on. So you think about ELA and language. That is if you're strong in this intelligence type, then you typically will do well in school, especially English, social studies, the humanities classes. And then the intrapersonal is the person who is in tune with themselves. And they may be more introverted, but not necessarily, because this is I'm one of my strengths as well, but I'm not an introvert. I'm an extroverted person for the most part. But I am also the type of person that is very much in tune with myself. I check in with myself. I do, my own self-work and things like that. And then the last one is the spatial intelligence. And so this is for people who are strong with like the arts and visualizing, like they have a good photographic memory. They may go somewhere one time and they remember exactly how to get there every time from moving forward. That is not a strength of mine at all. I definitely need Google Maps every time, no matter how many times. And so these are the different intelligence types that are identified by Howard Gardner, but there are other people who have, added to his study over time. But it's important to know these different learning styles of these different intelligence types when you are engaging the learner, because this is the way that you can become equitable and have an equitable learning environment, whether that's a classroom or a boardroom or wherever it may be, but where there are learners, these are the different modalities and intelligence types that learners can have. And it's not necessary to show which, to know exactly what each learner's strengths and weaknesses are, or their needs. I really don't use the word weaknesses, but like what engages them versus what challenges them, or what their dominant intelligence types are, their dominant versus less dominant learning styles. But the key is to know that, to keep all of this in mind when you are designing a curriculum, designing learning for learners, so that you want to just be able to engage everyone, but you also don't want to just engage them. So you don't want to, like, and this is even more specific for younger learners, students like K-12, you don't want to only provide them with opportunities to engage in the way that's dominant for them, but you also want to challenge them and strengthen their other intelligence types. So we all are in various levels of the spectrum for each of these learning styles and each of these intelligence types, but we also have areas that we're dominant in and areas that we're less dominant in. All right, so then we can move on to the next slide. So I want to ask a few of you to unmute your mic, or you can share in the chat, but we would love to hear some voices. Which engage you? What do you feel is your dominant learning style, or what are some of your dominant intelligence types, and which are some challenges for you? I shared that spatial is definitely a challenge for me. As a child, the naturalist I did not like to be outside. I appreciate the outdoors much more now as an adult, but I was not into, it was very much a challenge for me to be in nature. So I would just invite some of you to unmute your mic and share, just so we can hear some other voices. Thank you. I'm just going to also check the chat.
Okay, I guess I can share. Well, I've definitely always been introspective. So I consider that to be one of my strengths. Whenever I'm working alone, I accomplish a lot more than when I work with a team. What do I find challenging? I guess I'm more of a visual learner. So just hearing something is not enough. I have to see it, I have to understand it. So that's kind of my learning style. I have to see it and understand it in order for me to really learn. So like yourself, I've also taught myself to be extroverted. And as a result, I've been able to really accomplish goals working in the space that I work in, which is managing a program where I have to work with groups of people, large groups of people. So, but like if I had a choice, I'd rather just be behind the scenes and doing my own thing, learning visually.
Thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate that. Would anyone else like to share? I see we have some comments in the chat too. Dana said that visual is a preference, a strength, in that Dana does really well with infographics. Courtney identified visual and naturalist as Courtney's styles, and relates to the lack of spatial intelligence. Yes. Yes. Ironically, I'm also an artist, but I'm an abstract artist. So I can't like just recreate. My daughter can recreate an image that she sees and just draws it first. So I could never do that, but I do abstract art. That works for me. Elliot also shared visuals with videos work well. So thank you. And if you want to continue to add to the chat, please feel free to do so. Thank you. We can move on. Thank you. All right, so now I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of differentiated instruction. This is a way to be equitable when helping learners to gather information that is necessary for whatever the context is that they need that information for. And so differentiated instruction is the practice of tailoring teaching methods, materials, and activities to meet the diverse needs of students. So we often, again, students, it uses synonymously with learner. And so you may not have young children who you have to provide content information to. It may be adults that you are, but this still applies. All right. And so when it comes to differentiation, it involves the lessons content, the differentiating the lessons process, and also the product that the learners will produce as a result of the lessons. And what it does is it accommodates different learning styles, different abilities, as well as different interests. And differentiate instruction ensures that all students or all learners can access the curriculum and achieve success. So there are a variety of ways of differentiating instruction. It's just the concept of differentiating instruction is what the instructor should always keep in mind, and really valuing that there are a variety of learners who are going to need to be able to access this information. And not everybody, the access point is not the same for every learner. Okay, we can go on. So the Universal Design for Learning model is a very popular model. It's a framework for designing flexible learning environments that accommodate all learners from the start. So I just talked about the access, like the entry points, that's the very beginning, but all the way throughout the entire journey of whatever it is that is to be learned. So the three principles are engagement, which is the why of learning. It's focused on the effective networks of the brain. We also have the representation principle, which is the what of learning, and it focuses on the recognition networks of the brain. And then we have the action and expression principle, which focuses on the how of the learning and the strategic networks of the brain. Go to the next slide. So just to break it down just a little bit more about each principle. So you should, as an instructor, you should provide multiple means of engagement. So thinking back to the different types of learners, the different types of intelligence types, you want to think about how are you going to tap into the students' interests and motivations, which for this, it is important to know your learner in order to be able to tap into their interests and motivations, but you don't have to necessarily know their learning style or intelligence type, but it's more like what things interest you? What are the things that motivate you? What makes you want to go? And then you also want to make sure that you encourage active participation and self-regulation in learning. So, you hear me saying, I want to hear other voices. I don't want to be the only one that's talking. I want to engage, you all in the process. And so I'm trying to bring you into the process, whether that's unmuting your mic or sharing in the chat. You also, the other principle of representation, you want to provide multiple means of representation. So that's about presenting content using various methods. All right. So we talked about these specifically are addressing the learning styles. So you want to have people be able to gather information visually, but also from using the auditory modality and the tactile. The tactile is just another term for kinesthetic, for touch and feel and doing things with your body. And we're not necessarily doing the tactile piece today, but we definitely have the visual and the auditory piece. It's a little bit more challenging sometimes in the virtual space to do tactile, but you can, even through stretching and things, just to even just get those physical juices flowing can be a way of being responsive to a kinesthetic learning. And also under this principle, it's about addressing different ways that students process information. Okay. And so again, that's the learning styles. Then you also want to provide multiple means of action and expression. And this dives in a little bit more to the multiple intelligences, because I'll just share for me as an educator, I used to provide students with the opportunity to demonstrate their understanding Of course, through writing, that's the classic way. Again, I've shared, the American education system specifically caters to those who have high intelligence in the areas of the verbal linguistic and the mathematical logical intelligence types. But there are 7 others. And so for me, understanding that, I would also offer students the opportunity to create a poem. I would let them create a podcast if they wanted, or a video on it if they wanted to do a skit. I'm an old school hip hop person, a hip hop baby. And so if students want to write a rap, they could write a rap or a song. Like if you're musically inclined, this is your opportunity to be able to do something in a way that is exciting to you. If students were artistic, they could create an artistic visual representation when applicable. Now, of course, this couldn't be every time, because the reality is students have to take assessments. And so they also have to, know how to take, being that assessments are not yet at the place where they allow for multiple means of expression. Right now, it's just only the paper. Well, now they're becoming computerized, but it's still just that classic verbal linguistic style. So of course, you do still have to pull that in, but the more ways that you can provide opportunities for students, the better. For the interpersonal, they can have a conversation with another person about the information, the introspective, maybe they write a journal entry. So, there are a variety of ways that you can incorporate those intelligence types to provide multiple means of action and expression. So as a recap, the benefits of the universal design for learning are that it's accessible. It allows all learners, including those with disabilities, to be able to access learning materials. It can be customized. So, ideally you tailor learning experiences to meet individual needs. And it also ultimately increases student engagement by offering choices and a variety of challenges. Thank you. So that is the end of my portion. Sharon, or Elizabeth, turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick final comment that there are so many connections with trauma-informed practice and universal design for learning. We're also including a resource that's a running checklist for checking for using universal design and reducing barriers to learning in any environment. And we want to let you get back to your life if you need to, but we have time for a couple of questions now, and then we will also close out and take it off recording for informal.
I placed my question in the chat just really quickly. I was curious to know, I'm far removed from my days of educational psychology, but I was familiar with 8 multiple intelligences, and I was just curious to know which is the 9th wonder.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, the 9th one is the existential.
Existential. Okay. Awesome. I will do my due diligence to learn more. Thank
Yes. Yep. Thank you for asking that. I appreciate that. Because when I learned it, it was 8 and the 9th one was starting to get introduced. It was still a little controversial about, like, do we want to include spirituality as an intelligence type? But eventually the community was like, this is a real thing that is a real, it's real for many people. So I appreciate you asking that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
And from Victoria. Victoria, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, I love all of these. I've seen some. Some of them are new to me, and I feel like I've worked a lot with nonprofit organizations, and the thing that seems to always happen is there's a desire to go through these thoroughly go through the steps, especially the earlier steps. But what inevitably happens is that there's a financial deficit or an urgency around let's just develop it. Let's just implement it. Let's just get it out there. And a lot of times the analysis part and the evaluation part are kind of short shrifted. And so I'm wondering how you all think about kind of pushing back on some of this and really kind of giving the time towards it while also, you know, honoring the fact that people, you know, have these, or at least in a lot of times, sometimes they feel they have limitations, sometimes they really do have the limitations, but the limitations are presented nonetheless. So how do you kind of work around them and kind of give fidelity to some of these models and concepts so that they can be executed as thoroughly as possible?
Honestly, Victoria, this is Elizabeth speaking. This workshop is a snippet of a fuller program that came about because just referencing like the fields of practice or the acronyms and showing some articles can give a little bit of gravity to this stuff. I think that it can feel really like vague or open to interpretation when you set out to do a learning project. In my experience, in a very complex multi-site professional development program that I was facilitating the development of, surprised me a little bit that where we had a very hard time gaining traction, but when I brought in a simple worksheet with the ADDIE initials and what they each stood for, there was like a collective sigh of relief on the committee. And it blew my mind a little bit because it's not necessarily new concepts. I mean, these are things that, you know, many people do in their work, but to see it together and to know that like there's a field of study, that was something that gave a little bit of gravity and kind of set a bench a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So just one thought. I mean, obviously not one size fits all for solutions.
Yeah, such a great point, Elizabeth. I'm definitely resonating with that too. I'll mention I did put in the chat, we're gonna move to a slide that'll have the link to the survey on it, but if anyone is planning to need to get back to something else and leave early, the link is in the chat for you. I wanted to also mention to Ife that I do have a book that was written by a professor who led our graduate program, Tojo Thatchenkari. He wrote a book called Appreciative Intelligence. So he was trying to make the argument for another intelligence. And he used the great metaphor of seeing the mighty oak in the acorn. And I really love that metaphor of people who can see the potential in something and their ability to draw that out of something that isn't there yet. So it's a really great book.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Sharon. I'm going to look into that because that would be an area that would be high intelligence type for me. I keep an attitude of gratitude and consider myself a visionary. So I love that. That definitely speaks. Thank you.
And just to bring that full circle, that is how I have always experienced you, Ife, and as I've learned more about the community-based education movement.
Thank you.
So yeah, there are so many concepts that we might not have been able to touch on today, and many that everyone here will bring in also. It is expansive and abundant, and the source of learning is not only limited to what's written, but thank you for coming together today and trying to give space and dialogue to what we can generate together. So please give yourselves a round of applause for pouring into yourself and connect with us in social. We're going to share all the slides and the resources. I'll turn it to Sharon to bring the recording to a close and have our informal conversation.
Yes, absolutely. I know we went by those social slides real fast, but those will be on the slides that are shared as part of the follow-up. So you'll be able to link to those. We just wanted to let you know that they're there.